The auction grounds buzzed with an energy that only came when fortunes were at stake. Beneath the grand chandeliers of the bidding hall, the wealthiest men in the region gathered, their polished boots tapping against the marble floor as they sized up the animals on display. To them, this was a game of power, a chance to flaunt their influence, to outbid rivals, and to claim the finest horses money could buy. But in the shadows, away from the laughter and the clinking of expensive whiskey glasses, stood a man who didn't belong. His coat was worn at the edges, his boots caked in the dirt of hard labor, and his presence barely earned a second glance. He wasn't here for spectacle or prestige. He was here for something only he could see. The auctioneer's voice rang through the hall, commanding attention as the prized stallions were paraded one by one. Magnificent creatures, their muscles rippling under the glow of the chandeliers, fetched small fortunes with every nod of a millionaire's head. The bidding wars were fierce, and each sale ended with applause, as yet another thoroughbred was claimed. Then, the next horse was led out, and the energy in the room shifted. It wasn't the kind of shift that came with excitement. It was the quiet murmur of disappointment. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, a few unimpressed shakes of the head. The animal before them wasn't impressive at first glance. Its coat, though clean, lacked the glossy sheen of its predecessors. It stood differently, its posture not quite the commanding stance expected of a champion. It wasn't scrawny, nor was it weak, but something about it simply didn't demand attention the way the others had. The rich men in their tailored suits barely spared it a glance before returning to their drinks. This one wasn't worth their time. But in the back of the hall, the farmer's eyes narrowed. He saw what they didn't. He saw the strength hidden beneath the unassuming frame, the intelligence in its gaze, the subtle way it carried itself, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. He had spent his entire life working the land, tending to animals not for show, but for survival. And he knew with absolute certainty that this was no ordinary horse. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to maintain enthusiasm. "Shall we start the bidding at 5,000? Silence. A few muttered words between businessmen, a scoff from one corner of the room. The auctioneer's smile faltered, but he pressed on. 4,000? Again, nothing. The wealthy had already dismissed the horse, uninterested in wasting their money on something that didn't scream success. Then, just as the auctioneer was about to lower his expectations further, a voice rang out from the back. 1,000. The room turned, as if suddenly reminded that he was there at all. The farmer's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. A few of the men chuckled, some shaking their heads in amusement. To them, this was an act of desperation, a poor man grasping at whatever scraps he could afford. But he wasn't laughing. His expression remained steady, his gaze locked onto the horse as if the rest of the world had faded away. 1,000? That's all? Someone scoffed from the front row. Might as well give it away. Laughter followed, but the farmer didn't flinch. He didn't need their approval. The auctioneer hesitated. He had seen enough bidding wars to know when an offer was serious, and when it was just entertainment for the crowd. "Do I hear 2,000? He waited, scanning the room, but there was no response. The rich had already moved on, whispering among themselves about the next horse on the list. 1,000, going once. The farmer's fingers curled slightly at his sides. He could feel it the moment when something unseen shifted in his favor. Going twice. Somewhere near the front, a man nudged his friend, muttering something about charity cases and wasted money. Sold. A sharp bang of the gavel sealed the deal, but the reaction was underwhelming. No murmurs of admiration, no impressed nods. The sale was insignificant to them, but for the farmer, it was everything. He stepped forward, his boots now the only sound against the polished floor, The horse's dark eyes met his as if it, too, understood what had just happened. As if it knew it had been seen for what it truly was. What no one realized was that this moment, the moment they dismissed with laughter and indifference, was the beginning of something far greater than they could ever imagine. The stable hands barely paid him any mind as he led the horse outside. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the auction yard. The murmurs from the wealthy bidders faded behind him, their laughter and scoffs already shifting to the next spectacle. To them, this had been nothing more than a forgettable transaction. But the farmer knew better. As his hand rested against the horse's neck, he felt something that went beyond instinct, a certainty that he had just made the best decision of his life. The horse moved with a quiet grace, its hooves pressing into the dirt, with a steadiness that didn't match the dismissive judgment of the crowd. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was something else, something harder to define. The farmer led it to a quiet stretch of open land near the edge of the auction grounds, away from prying eyes. He needed to see it move, to confirm what he already suspected. With a silent nod, he stepped back and gave a small signal. The horse hesitated for the briefest moment, then it took off. The shift was instant. What had seemed unremarkable under the cold scrutiny of the rich men now exploded into something entirely different. Speed, power, and precision merged into a spectacle that should have never been ignored. The wind kicked up dust as the horse moved, its strides impossibly fluid, each step controlled yet bursting with raw energy. It was fast, unbelievably fast. But it wasn't just speed, it was the way the animal adjusted itself. The way it seemed to anticipate the terrain, shifting at just the right moments with a level of awareness far beyond the ordinary. The farmer's heart pounded. This wasn't just a good horse. This was something else entirely. Behind him, a presence made itself known. He turned to find one of the stable workers standing there, eyes wide with disbelief. The man had seen thousands of horses pass through the auction house, had handled animals from the most expensive bloodlines money could buy. And yet, as he watched this one move, his expression shifted from confusion to something closer to awe. The worker trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. That's not normal. The farmer didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already knew. What he hadn't noticed was that others had begun to take interest. At first, just a few wandering eyes from those lingering near the auction yard. Then, the whispers spread. The same men who had dismissed the horse, who had smirked at the farmer's bid, now found themselves craning their necks to get a better look. The laughter had stopped. One of them, a businessman who had spent years boasting about his ability to pick the finest stock, pushed through the gathering onlookers. His expression was unreadable at first, but as he watched, his fingers tightened around the edge of his coat. He had ignored this horse without a second thought. And now, watching it in motion, he realized his mistake. "How much do you want for it?" The words cut through the murmurs like a blade. They weren't spoken with the usual air of casual interest. There was an edge to them, something urgent beneath the controlled tone. The farmer turned, meeting the man's gaze. He could see it in his eyes, that flicker of desperation, of someone who had just recognized something valuable too late. The same man who had laughed at his bid now stood before him, hoping to correct his own arrogance with a simple transaction. But the farmer only smiled. The kind of smile that carried the weight of knowing something no one else had understood until now. "It's not for sale." The words landed heavier than expected, sending a ripple through the gathered crowd. The businessman's jaw tightened. Others stepped forward, some murmuring their own offers, some trying to disguise their interest with feigned indifference. But the farmer had already made up his mind. He had seen something they hadn't. He had believed when no one else did. And now, They were the ones chasing what they had so easily thrown away. The tension in the air was different now. No longer laughter, no longer scoffs, just silence, thick with unspoken regret. The farmer could feel their stares, their growing desperation. But he remained calm, his fingers lightly tracing the side of the horse's neck. The animal stood still beside him, steady as ever, as if it too knew the shift in power that had just taken place. These men, these so-called experts, had missed something extraordinary right in front of them. And now they wanted to claim it as their own. One by one, the offers came. First, cautious, an attempt to ease into negotiations. Then bolder, money thrown at the problem like it could erase their mistake. But the farmer didn't flinch. Each number they called out was met with the same quiet, unwavering resolve. Then, something changed. A figure emerged from the crowd, not just another bidder, but someone with authority, the auction house's owner. Unlike the others, he hadn't laughed earlier, nor had he dismissed the farmer outright. His expression now was one of careful calculation. He had seen countless deals, had witnessed fortunes won and lost in a single bid. And yet, this was something different. "You don't know what you have," the owner said finally. His voice low, measured. "But I do." The farmer met his gaze, waiting. "I'll double the highest offer," the owner continued, stepping closer. "No, triple it. Cash in hand. You'll walk away from here with more money than you've ever seen." The crowd hushed, waiting for the answer. The weight of the moment pressed against the farmer, but he didn't hesitate. His grip on the reins tightened slightly, his decision already made. "I'm not walking away from anything," he said simply. The owner exhaled sharply through his nose, a flicker of frustration breaking through his composure. "You're making a mistake." The farmer only smiled. "No, I'm not." He turned then, leading the horse away, leaving behind a room full of men who suddenly wished they could undo the past few hours. The murmurs followed him, some still calling out last-minute offers. But he never once looked back. Days passed, and the story should have ended there, but it didn't. The first sign that something was truly different came when he took the horse home. It wasn't just fast, it was something else entirely. Each morning, as they rode across the open fields, the farmer pushed it a little harder, testing its limits. And every time, the horse answered without hesitation, moving in a way that defied logic. It was not just instinct, it was as if it knew what he wanted before he even asked. Every turn, every adjustment, executed with a precision that shouldn't have been possible. Then, the rumors started. Word spread fast about the mysterious horse that had been overlooked, about the poor man who had seen something no one else did. People came to watch, expecting to see a simple stroke of luck, but what they saw left them speechless. The horse's speed, its endurance, its intelligence. It was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Trainers, breeders, even retired champions of the track came to see it for themselves. And every single one left with the same quiet, stunned expression. It was no ordinary animal. One day, a man arrived at the farm. Not a bidder, not another skeptic looking to prove himself right, but someone who carried the weight of true authority. He introduced himself as the owner of a prestigious racing syndicate, one that had never before taken an interest in unknown horses. But he had heard the stories, and he wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. The test was simple. A challenge, really. The syndicate had brought one of their best, a horse that had already broken records, already proven itself on the biggest stages. The farmer didn't hesitate. Without ceremony, without hesitation, he mounted his horse and took position beside the champion. The moment the signal was given, the world blurred. The horse didn't just run, it moved like it had been born for this moment. The champion never stood a chance. What had been meant as a test turned into a revelation. By the time they reached the finish line, the other rider was staring in shock, his prized animal completely outmatched. The syndicate owner didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, he turned to the farmer. "There are no bloodlines that explain this," he murmured. "This is something else." The farmer only nodded. He had known from the start. That night, as he stood by the stable, watching the horse rest beneath the moonlight, he thought back to the auction. To the laughter, the dismissals, the way they had all been so sure of what they knew. They had measured worth in wealth, in prestige, in what had already been proven. But real value? That was something else entirely. And as he ran a hand down the horse's mane, he couldn't help but wonder how many other treasures had the world thrown away simply because they didn't shine at first glance.